Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Science Story. This is your time to slow down, to let the world soften at the edges, and to drift somewhere quieter for a while. Tonight, we're going to whisper our way back to a question as old as wonder itself. How did life begin? Not just human life, or even animal life, but life itself. The first flicker, the first molecule that decided not to fall apart. It didn't arrive with a trumpet or a lightning strike. It crept in softly, like fog rolling over a warm stone. And tonight, we'll follow that mist not to find definitive answers, but to marvel at the beautiful possibility that life may have started not with a bang, but with a gentle breath. Before we begin this dreamy unraveling of origin stories, I'd love it if you gave this video a gentle like, and maybe tapped on subscribe if these sleepy science journeys bring you peace. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I love picturing minds quietly wandering across the globe, all drifting to sleep through science together. So, fluff your pillow. Let your thoughts trail like dandelion seeds in a slow breeze, and let's begin. Let's begin with something deceptively simple. What is life? Not the technical version with biology terms lined up like soldiers on a page, but the gentle, uncertain version that appears when you're lying in the dark with your thoughts half asleep. We know life when we see it. A cat curled up in a window, a sprout reaching for light, the rhythm of breath. But when we try to define it, truly define it, it slips through our fingers like sand or smoke. Some say life is self-sustaining chemical reactions. Others call it the ability to replicate or evolve. But at its heart, life might be best described as a kind of persistence, a refusal to unravel. A moment where matter, without knowing why, chooses to hold together just a little longer than expected. What makes the question even sleepier, in the loveliest way, is that we've never found life anywhere else in the universe. Not yet. Not on Mars, not on Europa, not in the clouds of Venus, despite their allure. That makes us, for now, both the observers and the observed. We are life trying to understand life, using a brain that is itself the result of 4 billion years of blind slow-making. It's like a flame trying to study fire without burning the page, so we look back not just in time, but in imagination. We rewind the film of Earth until the continents melt, until the oceans are young, until even the moon hasn't quite found its distance. We go back to when Earth was still raw and boiling, its skies thick and red, its seas hot and restless. At that point in our planet's history, there were no flowers or forests or fish, no cells, no DNA, not even the humble proteins that make up muscles and enzymes. There were only molecules, tiny, jittery things bumping into one another in an atmosphere dense with possibility. Lightning crackled, volcanoes hissed, the seas steamed with heat from below, into that chaotic soup of elements, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur. Something remarkable began to stir. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but over time, and with just enough persistence to keep going, molecules formed shapes that didn't immediately fall apart. Some shapes began to copy themselves. Others twisted into loops or folds that let them do tiny, useful things. And though most of them simply dissolved or broke, a few lingered, and lingering, they began to accumulate. It's easy to imagine this as a moment, but it wasn't a moment at all. It was more like a drifting fog that thickened over centuries, over millions of years, until it slowly started to take a shape we would one day recognize as living. Life didn't begin with a spark. It began with patience, and if that sounds too poetic to be science, well, maybe science has a little poetry tucked into its folds after all, because here we are, breathing and blinking and wondering, all because something very small, very long ago decided not to let go. To imagine how life began, we have to set the stage properly. Not the gentle blue and green earth we know now, but a world young and restless, still cooling from its formation. The skies above were thick and murky, filled with carbon dioxide and methane. The sun was dimmer than it is today, casting a reddish hue through a swirling atmosphere that never quite cleared. Beneath those heavy clouds, the surface of Earth simmered. The land cracked and hissed, constantly reshaped by volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts. The oceans, still forming, boiled in places from geothermal heat. It was not a friendly world, but it was not empty either. It was full of ingredients, and more importantly, it was full of motion. In that early ocean, molecules wandered. The water was dense with them, a sort of molecular soup, warmed by volcanic vents and stirred by the churn of tides and heat. Scientists have often described this environment as a primordial soup, which makes it sound like something simple, like a broth in a pot. But this was no ordinary kitchen. This soup was chaotic, a frothy sea of collisions and reactions. The heat helped things move. The lightning and radiation from space helped things change. Over time, some of these wandering molecules began to stick together, perhaps at first by chance, like sugar dissolving into tea. But then, over time, the bonds held a little longer, and eventually, some of these combinations became stable enough to persist. Some molecules arranged themselves into chains, others formed rings. A few developed shapes that let them interact with their surroundings in new ways. One molecule might accidentally protect another from breaking apart. Another might begin to fold in on itself, creating a pocket that could shelter smaller parts inside. These weren't yet alive in any sense we'd recognize, but they were no longer just drifting, aimlessly. They were starting to exhibit behavior, not purposeful, not conscious, but reactive, sensitive, interactive, and in a world like early Earth, that was enough. Some scientists believe these early molecules may have gathered near places like hydrothermal vents, where hot mineral-rich water spews from cracks in the ocean floor. These vents create natural gradients of temperature and chemistry, and they could have acted like tiny laboratories, testing combinations of matter over and over again. In these dark, pressurized places, certain patterns might have formed more easily, and once a useful shape appeared, it had a slightly better chance of sticking around. And that's all life needs at first. Not a grand purpose or plan, just a slight advantage, just enough stability to survive the next wave. The picture of early Earth is not a dramatic spark, but a quiet persistence. Molecules didn't race toward life. They drifted toward it, pulled not by intent, but by what worked. And the strange part is, no single molecule had to understand the process. The planet did the work for them. The energy, the movement, the conditions, all of it turned random chemistry into something new. And somewhere in that restless ocean, the first whispers of life began to take hold, so gently that the planet itself barely noticed. Now that we've wandered into Earth's earliest oceans, let's look up for a moment. Not at the stars, because in those days the stars were nearly invisible behind a blanket of thick gases, but at the strange sky itself. The air was dense with volcanic fumes and drifting chemicals, painting the heavens in hues we can barely imagine. It wasn't blue. There was no oxygen yet, no protective layer to scatter sunlight in the way we know today. Instead, the sky glowed with a deep, ruddy orange, perhaps tinged with purple or copper, depending on the chemical stew swirling through the atmosphere. When the sun rose, it might have looked more like a smoldering ember than a golden disk. Its light filtered through haze and smoke, casting long red shadows across the ocean's surface. That ocean, stretching endlessly beneath the alien sky, was already beginning to change. On the surface, wind stirred the waves. Below, geothermal heat bubbled up from within the planet. The seafloor cracked open in places, releasing mineral-rich water into the surrounding darkness. These vents created warm pockets in the deep, where elements collided with energy in a way that was entirely new. Earth had become a planet of gradients, warmth and cold, light and dark, acidic and alkaline. These contrasts created movement, and in that movement, something began to stir. We can picture it now, not as a single place or moment, but as countless small zones of possibility. Tiny corners of the sea where the chemistry was just right for something rare to happen. Molecules didn't simply float around like leaves in a pond. They responded to their environment. They stuck to mineral surfaces, or became trapped in little rock pores, or were concentrated by evaporation in shallow pools. In these varied spaces, the early ingredients of life found one another again and again, not because they were seeking each other, but because the planet gave them places to meet. These weren't living things, not yet, but some of them behaved in ways that made them stand out. A molecule that folded into a protective shell could avoid being broken apart by heat. Another that replicated itself more efficiently had more copies drifting nearby. Some even catalyzed reactions, helping other molecules change form. All of this was happening quietly, in the dark, under a sky that glowed red by day and black by night. There were no sounds except the hiss of steam, the rush of tides, and the slow movement of Earth's crust. But beneath it all, something was beginning. It's strange to think that life began not under the stars, but beneath a sky that would have seemed utterly alien to us now. No blue, no clouds, no breeze as we know it, just thick warmth and chemical haze, gently holding the early ocean in place. That sky watched over the slow dance of molecules turning into something more. It held the heat and kept the pressure steady. And while it offered no light for photosynthesis, it did provide a kind of cover, a sheltering dome under which life could practice being alive. When we imagine the beginning of life, it's tempting to think of a single, dramatic moment. A flash of lightning, a puddle of goo, and suddenly, something wriggles. That image has captured imaginations for decades, and there's some truth to it. Lightning did strike Earth's early surface often, and the energy it delivered certainly helped stir the chemical pot. But the more we study it, the more we see that life didn't begin with a single spark. It began with persistence. The spark may have helped, but the real magic was much slower, much gentler, and perhaps more beautiful because of it. Instead of a single event, we can picture millions of tiny ones, stretched out across time and scattered across the planet. Every molecule that bonded in a new way, every chain that lasted a little longer, every structure that repeated itself, that was the beginning. And it didn't happen just once. It happened again and again. A quiet chorus of chemical attempts, most of which failed, but a few of which kept going. There was no direction, no intention. Just a soft bias toward survival, nudged forward by Earth's constant motion. The idea of life as a slow accumulation rather than a sudden birth is both comforting and humbling. It means that the building blocks of living things weren't made in a moment of genius, but rather through countless trials, molecules that didn't fall apart right away, patterns that managed to stick around. At first, it might have been as simple as a strand of atoms forming a loop instead of a line, or a surface where certain shapes clung more tightly than others. These aren't dramatic moments, but over time, they made all the difference. One of the most intriguing ideas is that energy gradients, like those found near hydrothermal vents, may have helped drive these early steps. The difference in temperature or chemistry from one side of a rock wall to another might have created little flows of energy, just enough to keep reactions going, just enough to encourage the molecules to try something new. In these slow, steady environments, the world experimented, and it did so in complete silence. It's hard to say how long this stage lasted. It could have taken millions of years for the first truly self-sustaining chemical systems to arise, and even then they were not yet alive in the way we think of today, but they were something close. Something hopeful, a preview. These systems were just barely on the other side of chemistry, not quite biology, but not just soup anymore, so the spark we often imagine might never have happened at all. Or maybe it happened 1,000 times in 1,000 different places, in 1,000 different ways. None of them loud, none of them final. Just quiet beginnings, folded into the rhythms of a restless planet, waiting patiently to become something more. As the early Earth continued to simmer and swirl, something remarkable began to take shape. Among the countless molecules drifting through the seas, some began to show preference. Not emotions, not decisions, but a kind of chemical leaning. Some molecules repelled water, others clung to it. Some folded into intricate shapes, like paper cranes with invisible wings. These molecules weren't alive, but they were starting to act a little like they were trying to be. Imagine a drop of early ocean water, warmed by the sun and filled with a tangle of strange little compounds. Most of these molecules are simple. They bump into each other, fall apart, reform and drift away. But every now and then, one of them behaves differently. It doesn't just float. It folds. It sticks to another. It avoids the water in a way that makes it cluster together with similar shapes. These tiny behaviors, barely noticeable in isolation, begin to matter. Some molecules prefer oily environments. They turn away from water, huddling together like leaves trying to stay dry. Others are more open, allowing themselves to float freely, drawn toward the water's embrace. These preferences affect where the molecules end up, what they stick to, and how long they last. And slowly, patterns emerge. Structures that aren't alive, but almost seem like they're rehearsing for the role. Among these molecular performers, some begin to assist in chemical reactions. They might fold in such a way that they encourage other molecules to break apart or bind together. These are primitive catalysts, helping speed things along. It's not that they know what they're doing. It's just that their shape happens to be helpful. And in a world ruled by chance, a helpful shape is a powerful thing. Over time, certain groups of molecules become more common. Not because they're better in a moral sense, but because they last longer. They drift into places where the conditions are just right. They take part in reactions that copy them. Not perfectly, and not often, but enough. Enough to keep them in the mix. Enough to make them harder to ignore. It's easy to think of this as randomness, but it's more than that. It's filtered randomness, the kind that, over countless iterations, begins to resemble something deliberate. Molecules that stick around long enough start to shape their environment in small ways. They create little pockets of order, a fold here, a bond there, a group of molecules clinging together in a way that starts to look suspiciously like structure. And so, without a mind, without a plan, and without a spark, chemistry inches closer to biology. The molecules aren't just reacting anymore. They're interacting. They're favoring some paths over others. They're doing things. And even if they don't understand, even if they never will, the pattern is clear. Something quiet is building. And in the stillness of the early sea, the foundations of life are beginning to hum. Somewhere in that ancient chemical sea, a peculiar molecule began to play an unexpected role. It wasn't the biggest or the most stable, and it certainly wasn't alive. But it had a special talent, one that quietly set it apart. This molecule was RNA, a strand made of smaller pieces that could link together in many different ways. What made RNA special was not just its ability to store information, like a kind of primitive memory, but also its ability to do something with that information. In a time before life, that combination was extraordinary. Picture a strand of RNA floating through warm water, gently folding into loops and curves as it drifts. Its shape isn't random. It folds in ways that depend on the order of its pieces. Some folds help it survive, some allow it to interact with other molecules nearby. It's almost like a key that can twist just enough to fit into a lock, not to open a door, but to help another key turn more easily. In this way, RNA may have been both the instruction and the instructor. It held patterns and also helped those patterns play out. Unlike DNA, which came later, RNA is more fragile. It doesn't last as long, and it makes more mistakes when it copies itself. But in the beginning, that might have been a strength. Mistakes meant variety, and variety meant that some strands folded better, worked faster, or stuck around longer than others. These tiny advantages added up over time. In the long stretch of history where nothing yet breathed or beat, RNA may have been the first thing to try something new and keep doing it. Scientists sometimes call this the RNA world, a time before cells, when molecules like RNA may have been the closest thing Earth had to life. Of course, they weren't conscious. They didn't think or choose, but they repeated and they adapted. Some even developed the ability to help copy themselves, making rough versions of themselves using the same basic parts. It wasn't perfect, and most of those copies likely fell apart. But again, all life needed in the beginning was persistence, just enough stability to keep going. RNA's ability to carry both instruction and action means it might have served as a bridge between chemistry and biology. It could have helped build proteins, the complex folded molecules that do so much of the work in living cells. Later on, DNA would take over the job of long-term memory, and proteins would take over most of the action. But RNA may have done both, at least for a while. In that sense, it was a quiet multitasker in a noisy world. So there it floated, twisting and turning, trying again and again, not with intention, but with potential. And in its loops and curls, life began to find a rhythm, a pattern that could be repeated, a gentle molecular hum that would one day become a heartbeat. In those early seas, long before there were creatures to swim through them or eyes to gaze upon their shimmer, the story of life unfolded one accident at a time. Most of these accidents came and went, leaving no trace at all. A molecule might form, twist itself into a new shape, drift for a moment, then fall apart. These were fleeting events, barely a whisper in the long breath of time. But now and then, something unexpected happened. A mistake occurred, and instead of disappearing, it lingered. It might not have been the best shape or the strongest bond, but it was good enough to survive just a little longer, and in that small extension of time, it made a difference. It is easy to forget how messy the beginnings of life must have been. There were no rules yet, no blueprints or systems to follow. Molecules came together in endless combinations, some helpful, some useless, and most just too unstable to matter. But sometimes, a molecule would fold in a slightly different way. Maybe it bound to something it hadn't before. Maybe it protected a nearby strand of RNA from falling apart. Maybe it copied itself in a clumsy, imperfect fashion and left behind a version that worked just a bit better. None of this was guided. It was all just the result of motion and chance. These early mistakes were not errors in the way we think of them. They were deviations, variations, slight departures from the most likely outcome. And now and then, one of those deviations would prove unexpectedly useful. Perhaps it stuck more easily to another molecule, or maybe it resisted being broken down by the surrounding water. Whatever the reason, it stayed. And staying, it opened the door for something else to happen. Over time, the sea began to fill with these survivors. Not many at first, and not in any organized way, but even a handful of persistent molecules can begin to shift the balance. Once a mistake proves beneficial, it becomes less like a flaw and more like a feature. A new pattern is born, and from that pattern, other possibilities can emerge. This is the quiet genius of early evolution. It did not require understanding, or even direction. It only needed variation and time, and it had plenty of both. Life did not come from perfection, it came from trial and error, from millions of tiny chemical stumbles, most of which led nowhere. But a few stumbled in the right direction, a fold that made replication easier, a bond that resisted heat, a loop that invited other loops to join. These were not planned, they were just lucky. But luck, when repeated across eons and oceans, begins to look a little like design. Not a design from above, but one built from the bottom up, by molecules that kept failing until one of them didn't. And in that moment, however brief, the world changed. Not with celebration or ceremony, but with quiet continuation. The first successful mistake, simply staying alive long enough to become part of the next. As the molecular world continued to shift and stir within the early oceans, another important idea began to take shape. It was not about copying or reacting, but about space, inside and outside. In a sea where everything mixed freely, this new development was subtle but profound. Some molecules began to form tiny bubbles. These bubbles were not filled with thoughts or purpose, but with potential. They were little envelopes of chemistry, separating one bit of water from all the rest. These bubbles were made from lipids, the same kinds of oily molecules that shy away from water. When dropped into a watery environment, these lipids naturally arrange themselves into thin layers, with the water-fearing ends tucked safely away from the liquid. And sometimes, those layers curl in on themselves, forming hollow spheres. We now call these structures vesicles. Back then, they were simply something new. Inside these bubbles, conditions could be different than the ocean outside. A slightly different balance of molecules, a quieter environment, a pocket of possibility. Imagine, if you will, one of these bubbles drifting through a warm tide pool, carrying with it a few strands of RNA or some scattered proteins. The membrane around it acts as a soft shield, keeping those molecules from being washed away or broken down too quickly. Nothing about it is alive, but it starts to feel a little like it wants to be. This idea of a boundary forming between the inner world and the outer one is a quiet revolution. It allows for chemistry to become a bit more local. Reactions can happen in a safer, more stable space. Molecules inside the bubble don't have to compete with the entire ocean anymore. They just need to make it work in that one small sphere. Some of these bubbles formed by chance. Others may have been helped along by environmental conditions. The heat from underwater, vents, the minerals in clay, the drying and wetting cycles of shallow shores. Every shift in temperature or texture gave these little structures a new chance to appear, to be tested by the conditions around them. And each time a bubble lasted a little longer or carried something more useful inside, it set the stage for the next step forward. Eventually, some of these bubbles began to do more than just contain. They may have helped concentrate molecules in ways that made replication more likely, or allowed certain reactions to happen more quickly. Slowly, and without any conscious goal, these tiny spheres began to resemble something we might one day call a cell, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. The creation of a boundary was not the beginning of life, but it brought life closer. It turned chaos into pockets of order. It turned random drift into protected experiments. And all of this happened not because anything planned it, but because some molecules folded and floated in ways that allowed them to stay, just a bit longer, inside the calm of a fragile little bubble. Drifting quietly through the warm oceans of early Earth, those tiny bubbles of chemistry began to gather more than just molecules. Over time, some of them became more than just containers. They began to host little chains of reactions. Inside, the molecules folded, copied, reacted, and tangled. Outside, the environment continued its endless dance of light, heat, and motion. And somewhere in between, a new kind of structure emerged. It was not quite alive, not yet, but it was something strangely close. These were protocells, and they were the almost life forms that helped bridge the gap between chemistry and biology. A protocell is like a practice run. It is a soft sphere made of lipids, with a watery center that holds a small collection of molecules. Sometimes those molecules were random. Other times, they included things like RNA, the single-stranded memory keeper from earlier. In our story, these protocells were not designed. They were formed by accident, again and again, in all kinds of conditions, but every once in a while, one of them worked a little better than the rest. It stayed whole for longer, it gathered more interesting parts inside, it let in useful molecules and kept out harmful ones. And when the environment changed, as it often did, some of these protocells survived just long enough to matter. Imagine a rocky shore under a soft red sky, where tide pools gather warmth during the day and cool again at night. In those pools, protocells come and go. Most are short-lived, their membranes too fragile or their contents too empty, but a few have just the right balance. Inside one, perhaps, an RNA strand is quietly copying itself with the help of a folded molecule that speeds the process. Inside another, a reaction is taking place that releases a little bit of energy. Not much, just enough to keep the molecules moving. These small differences begin to add up. A protocell that can hold itself together has a better chance of protecting its contents. One that can carry helpful molecules is more likely to spark the next round of reactions, and every improvement, no matter how small, gets passed along, not intentionally, not even consistently, but often enough that, over time, protocells begin to look less like random collections and more like the ancestors of cells. They still lacked many things. There were no chromosomes, no organelles, no way to truly grow or divide, but they had the shape. They had the beginnings of internal order, and most importantly, they had potential. With every wave that rolled over the shore, more protocells formed, and with every new day, some of them stayed intact just a little longer than the last. There is something quietly profound in that image. The sea, with its rhythm and repetition, giving rise to tiny worlds within bubbles, each one a fragile experiment, each one a soft whisper of what life would one day become, not with certainty, but with the quiet persistence of possibility. When we think of breathing, we picture lungs filling with air, the rise and fall of a chest, the familiar rhythm that marks life as we know it. But in the beginning, there was no oxygen to breathe. The early Earth was wrapped in a thick, oxygen-poor atmosphere, full of gases like methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and carbon dioxide, the kind of air that would choke any modern creature in an instant. And yet, it was in this very atmosphere that life began to stir. The earliest life forms did not breathe the way we do. They didn't have lungs or even mouths, but they still needed energy, because even the simplest living things require a spark to keep going. For them, that spark came from chemical reactions. They pulled energy not from the air, but from the world around them. Some fed on hydrogen gas, which was plentiful at the time. Others might have used sulfur or iron, pulling energy from the way these elements changed when combined with water and heat. These were not creatures in the usual sense. They were more like chemical systems wrapped in a protective bubble, doing just enough to stay stable, to continue, to not fall apart. And yet, within these quiet systems, the seeds of metabolism were taking root, a way to take in something from the outside world, use it, and release the leftovers. A beginning of the great give and take that defines all life. On the seafloor, hydrothermal vents spewed hot, mineral-rich water into the cold ocean. Around these vents, conditions were just right for strange chemistries to unfold. Here, temperature gradients and rich supplies of hydrogen sulfide may have powered some of the earliest forms of energy exchange. Molecules danced between heat and cold, between chemical inputs and outputs, slowly developing a rhythm. They found ways to borrow energy from the Earth itself, from rocks and gases and invisible gradients that flowed through the water. These early systems weren't efficient, they weren't tidy, but they worked just enough to matter. Over time, the reactions grew more complex. Some molecules became better at capturing energy, others better at storing it. Slowly, the foundations of what we now call respiration began to form. Not with oxygen, but with whatever the environment could offer. It's strange to imagine a world where breathing does not mean drawing air into lungs, but instead means the bubbling of gases through stone-lined cracks at the bottom of the sea. And yet, in this quiet, alien version of metabolism, life began to learn how to feed itself. It learned how to survive on the slow generosity of the earth, converting raw chemical energy into motion, replication, and growth. These first breaths were not audible. They did not stir the water or shake the ground, but they were there, steady and invisible, the beginnings of an ancient rhythm. A silent inhale and exhale that would one day echo through forests and fields and cities, but for now, it simply flowed in darkness, unnoticed and alive. Long after the first fragile bubbles had formed in the oceans and the earliest whispers of metabolism had begun, something extraordinary happened. Among all the drifting molecules and half-alive systems, one stood out. It was not louder or faster or more intelligent. In fact, it likely looked very much like all the others. But this organism, this ancient and humble creature, had something different. It succeeded in continuing, and more than that, it passed something along. That organism is known to us now by a quiet little name, Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Luca is not the first living thing. It is not the very beginning. But it is the point at which all current life begins to share a thread. Every animal, every plant, every fungus, every microbe on Earth today is, in some deep and molecular way, descended from this one cell. It did not carry a banner or wear a crown. It did not know that it had become central to the future of life on Earth. It simply endured where others did not. We do not know exactly what Luca looked like. It had no bones, no eyes, no color. But we believe it had a simple cell structure. It held its genetic information in the form of DNA. It used RNA to help make proteins. It had a membrane to keep the outside world at a safe distance. And inside, it carried the machinery of survival, enzymes to guide reactions, proteins to build and repair, possibly even tiny molecular motors spinning away in the dark like forgotten clocks. What makes Luca so special is not that it was spectacular, but that it worked. Its parts fit together well enough. Its code was stable enough. Its way of life was repeatable enough that it was able to reproduce, and its descendants kept reproducing too. The changes they underwent over time gave rise to all the variety we now see on Earth, from coral reefs to crows to the quiet cells lining the inside of your cheek. Luca likely lived in the ocean, perhaps near the warmth of hydrothermal vents. It probably did not move much, if at all. It lived on chemical energy, as its world had not yet learned to use sunlight in any meaningful way. It may have had companions, other forms of life that lived differently, but none of those survived through the ages. Only Luca's family line endured. Its cousins, its rivals, its neighbors, whatever forms they took, eventually vanished, leaving behind no children and no trace. To think of Luca is to think of a single cell floating in a vast sea, unnoticed by the universe, but quietly carrying the spark that would ignite forests, populate skies, and eventually sit under stars and ask where it all began. That spark did not flare brightly, it did not make a sound, but it burned steadily, passing from generation to generation, all the way to us. And even now, inside every cell in your body, something of Luca is still there, still humming, still alive. After Luca had quietly passed along its spark to the ever-branching tree of life, evolution began to take bolder steps. Life, once so simple and self-contained, started experimenting with something unexpected. Not just surviving, not just copying, but sharing. Deep in the ancient oceans, among cells that lived in solitude, a few began to blur the lines between one and another. It might have started with a single event. One cell swallowed another, not to destroy it, but to hold it. And somehow, instead of digestion, there was an agreement. The swallowed cell kept living, and it started helping. This idea sounds strange, even unnatural. One cell living inside another, but it is one of the most important events in the history of life. It may have happened more than once, in different ways, but one result stands out clearly: mitochondria. Tiny powerhouses that live inside almost every complex cell today. Once free-living bacteria, they were taken in, and instead of being broken down, they stayed. They offered energy. In return, they gained protection. A partnership was born, one so successful that it still powers nearly every breath you take. This moment, the beginning of endosymbiosis, is not just a technical detail in biology. It is a soft and almost poetic turn in the story. Life stopped only guarding itself and began building from within. Cooperation began to matter as much as competition. These early unions allowed for more complexity. Cells could grow larger, they could support more reactions, they could begin to specialize. Later, something similar happened again. A different kind of cell, capable of using sunlight, was swallowed. This time, it led to the birth of chloroplasts, the green factories inside plant cells. From that quiet union, the age of photosynthesis truly bloomed, and with it, the ability to turn sunlight into life on a much grander scale. The ancient ocean, once home to only simple forms of life, began to host cells filled with tiny collaborators. These symbiotic events did not happen often, but when they did, they changed everything. It is no exaggeration to say that without them, complex life as we know it would not exist. No trees, no mushrooms, no whales, no people. What is perhaps most lovely about these quiet collaborations is how enduring they have been. The mitochondria in your cells still carry bits of their original DNA, a little echo of their ancient independence. They are not just passengers, they are partners, just as they were at the beginning. In a world that had been built so far on chemical trial and solitary struggle, the idea of cells working together, of sharing space and duties, feels almost like a turning point in tone. The story becomes not just about survival, but about connection, and from that connection the world grew more intricate, more diverse, and more capable of becoming the living planet we now call home. It all began with a quiet invitation to stay, and stay they did. As life continued to gather strength in the ancient seas, a new transformation began to unfold, one so vast and world-changing that it would eventually shape the very air we breathe. Somewhere among the early microbes, a quiet talent appeared. A small group of cells developed the ability to use sunlight as a source of energy. It was a delicate trick, involving pigments that could catch light and use it to rearrange molecules. The process was called photosynthesis, and its byproduct, as it turns out, was oxygen. At first, this oxygen drifted unnoticed into the ocean. The early Earth had no use for it. Oxygen was not the friendly breath of life we think of today. Back then, it was strange and reactive. It did not stay in the air. It bonded quickly with iron and other minerals in the water. This is how entire layers of rock became banded with rust-red stripes. The planet was slowly soaking up oxygen like a sponge, tucking it into stone, but the sponge had a limit. Eventually, the rocks could hold no more, and the oxygen began to spill into the atmosphere. What followed was not a celebration, it was a crisis. Most early life had evolved in a world without oxygen. To them, it was toxic. It interfered with their chemistry, broke down their molecules, and poisoned their surroundings. For countless species, the appearance of oxygen was not a gift. It was a death sentence. Scientists call this moment the Great Oxidation Event. It was not a single day or even a single year. It was a slow rising tide of a gas that would change everything. As oxygen filled the sky, the planet's color began to shift. The air itself transformed. The chemistry of the oceans evolved, and many of the early life forms vanished, unable to adapt to the new environment. But not all life disappeared. Some microbes had the tools to cope. Others found refuge in oxygen-poor pockets of the world, and a few began to use oxygen to their advantage. They discovered that oxygen, for all its danger, was also powerful. It allowed for new kinds of energy production, faster, more efficient, more complex. With oxygen in the air, the sky itself began to change. For the first time, a protective layer of ozone formed high above the Earth. It shielded the surface from harmful radiation. This made it possible for life to eventually leave the oceans and begin exploring land. But all of that would come much later. For now, the planet was still adjusting to its new breath. It is strange to think that one of the most important moments in the history of life came from what we would now call pollution. A tiny cell released something into the world, not knowing it would reshape the future. The gas that would one day fill lungs and lift birds began as a quiet byproduct, and in changing the world, it very nearly ended life altogether. But somehow, in the shifting light and deepening air, life found a way to continue. The rising tide of oxygen brought more than a change in atmosphere. It brought a reckoning. For the vast majority of early life, this new gas was not a welcome guest. It was unfamiliar and dangerous. The delicate molecular systems that had evolved in its absence could not withstand its presence. Reactions that once flowed smoothly were suddenly interrupted. Cells began to corrode from the inside. Structures fell apart, and slowly, silently, extinction swept across the microbial world. It was not a dramatic collapse. There were no cries, no sudden flashes, only a long and quiet disappearance. Entire lineages of ancient organisms faded from the oceans. Some left behind traces in stone, thin layers of chemical change now buried deep in Earth's crust. Others vanished without a whisper. The world, once filled with endless chemical diversity, became quieter in ways we will never fully understand. But even in that great fading, life continued. Some organisms found safety in parts of the ocean where oxygen could not reach. Deep-sea sediments and anoxic environments became havens for the old ways of life. These quiet corners of the planet preserved ancient metabolisms that still survive today, hidden away in muddy depths and sulfur-rich springs. Other organisms adapted. They rewrote their chemistry to tolerate oxygen. They began using it not as a threat but as a tool. Oxygen, reactive and powerful, offered a new kind of energy. With it, cells could extract more from their food, produce more energy with fewer steps, and grow in ways that had not been possible before. What had once been poison became power. This transformation happened slowly, not in leaps, but in patient adjustments passed from one generation to the next. A slight change in one protein, a gentler pathway for managing damage. Over millions of years, these small shifts built the foundation for something new. A kind of life that not only tolerated oxygen but came to depend on it. This was a quiet turning point. Life had survived the catastrophe, and now it was beginning to rise. The world above responded as well. With more oxygen in the atmosphere, the sky began to change color. The reddish haze gave way to a deeper blue. Sunlight reached the oceans in new ways. The Earth became a place with clearer skies and cooler climates. Photosynthetic life expanded, covering the oceans with soft blooms of green and blue. The rhythms of the planet shifted. Daylight became more meaningful. Seasons began to take shape. What had begun as a slow poisoning became the basis for a new kind of world, and in surviving the crisis, life became more resilient. It discovered new ways to exist, new spaces to occupy, and new relationships to form. The extinction that could have ended everything instead opened a path forward, one that led, slowly and gently, toward complexity, toward creatures that would one day walk and wonder. But for now, the seas still held only simple forms, adjusting to the breath of a changing planet. For an unimaginably long time, life remained in the oceans. It moved with the currents, clung to rocks, and drifted in the sunlight. Most of it was soft, simple, invisible to the eye. Microbes and filaments, floating mats and silent colonies. There were no shells, no bones, no claws or eyes. Life was still figuring out how to build itself. And for a while, it seemed content to stay small. But change, as always, arrived quietly. Some of these simple forms began to build protective layers around themselves. Tiny structures of silica or calcium, barely noticeable but important. These were the first hard parts. They did not move or think, but they offered safety, a little armor in a world full of collisions. In these delicate shells, life had found a way to leave a mark. For the first time, creatures were able to fossilize, to preserve some part of themselves in stone. And so, the record of life began to write itself more clearly. As more creatures began to build structures, the ocean floor became a different kind of place. Shells broke apart and settled in layers. Some organisms started to burrow. Others floated with tiny spines that helped them drift in the currents. These changes were small, almost hesitant, but over millions of years, they added up. Life was no longer just surviving, it was beginning to shape its surroundings. The appearance of skeletons, even the simplest ones, opened a door. Bodies could now grow larger, supported by something solid. Muscles could pull against a frame. Movement became more controlled. A soft ripple through jelly gave way to purposeful motion. Some creatures began to swim, however slowly. Others clung to rocks, filtering food from the water. The diversity of forms began to expand, and along with it, the ways of living. Predation may have followed. With hard shells came the need to break them. Some creatures developed parts for grasping, scraping, or crushing. A slow arms race began, not with battles, but with tiny changes passed down over generations. One creature built a better defense, another found a way around it. And so the balance of life became more dynamic. This era, before the great explosions of diversity still to come, was a kind of gentle rehearsal. Life was testing the tools it would later use to extraordinary effect. It was still quiet, still small, but growing more ambitious. The oceans, once filled only with floating threads of cells, now held layers of life, creatures that crawled, swam, or anchored themselves. Creatures with shape and purpose, though still without voices or thought. These first skeletons were not declarations of dominance, they were whispers of what was possible. They allowed life to reach out just a little further, to try something slightly more complex, and with each successful step, the story grew deeper. The sea had always been alive, but now it was beginning to feel full. Roughly 540 million years ago, something extraordinary began to happen beneath the surface of the sea. Life, which had spent billions of years moving slowly, cautiously, and almost invisibly, suddenly burst into creativity. In what now appears as a short moment in the fossil record, the oceans came alive with forms that were stranger, more diverse, and more experimental than anything that had come before. This chapter in Earth's story is known today as the Cambrian explosion, and despite the dramatic name, it happened in silence. No fireworks, no noise, just the steady unfolding of nature's imagination. Before the Cambrian, life had been mostly soft and small. Simple mats of microbes, blobs that drifted, structures that held together just enough to survive. But during this explosion, creatures began to explore entirely new shapes. Some formed long, segmented bodies that could bend and crawl. Others grew bristled legs or delicate antennae. Eyes began to appear, allowing organisms to sense the world in new ways. There were spines and shells and flaps and fans, as if life were testing every possible combination, unsure what would work but eager to try. Many of the creatures from this time would look alien to us now. Some had dozens of legs, others had none. Some were covered in armor, others seemed almost transparent. Few of these forms survived into the present day, but their fossils remain, imprinted into stone like echoes of a dream. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor with intricate exoskeletons. Anomalocaris, with its wide eyes and swimming flaps, glided through the water hunting prey. These were not just new bodies, they were new behaviors. Life was no longer only absorbing and floating. It was hunting, hiding, building, chasing. What made this sudden diversification possible is still something of a mystery. Some believe a rise in oxygen levels allowed for more energy-hungry bodies to emerge. Others point to changes in climate, or the breaking up of ancient continents, which may have created new shallow seas and fresh opportunities for evolution to unfold. It may have been a combination of factors, all aligning at the right moment to let life stretch its creative muscles. What is certain is that the Cambrian was a time of possibilities. Evolution, which had once moved at a glacial pace, now galloped. It did not always succeed. Many forms appeared only briefly before vanishing again. But each experiment left behind lessons that would echo into future generations. Some of the basic body plans we see today were first explored during this time. The idea of a head and a tail, a nervous system, a segmented body. These may seem ordinary now, but they had to be invented. The Cambrian explosion was not loud, but it was full of energy. It was life discovering its own toolkit and beginning to build, not perfectly, not predictably, but beautifully. And though the ocean still held no voices, no songs, and no eyes that looked up at the stars, it was now teeming with the beginnings of movement, sensation, and choice. After the great bloom of the Cambrian seas, life continued to flourish beneath the waves. Creatures grew more complex, more aware, and more mobile. But even as the oceans teemed with activity, a quiet frontier waited just beyond the shore. Dry land, stretching empty under the sun, untouched by life. For millions of years, it remained a barren place. No grass, no trees, no footprints, just wind and stone. But eventually, life began to reach for it. The move to land was not sudden. It was not a grand exodus or a bold leap. It began with small steps, slow and uncertain. The earliest pioneers were not animals at all, but likely tiny green filaments clinging to damp rocks near the water's edge. These early algae, brushing up against air instead of seawater, had to find new ways to stay moist and survive under a harsher Sunday. But where the tide met the land, they found a kind of rhythm. Wet, then dry, exposed, then submerged. In this in-between world, they adapted. Soon, other forms of simple life followed. Fungi arrived, weaving themselves into soil and stone, breaking down minerals and unlocking nutrients. Some of these fungi began forming partnerships with early plants, a quiet collaboration that allowed roots to explore farther and to reach deeper. Together, these unlikely allies began to green the edge of the world. The surface, once silent and still, began to crack with growth. The plants that ventured further inland were small and low to the ground. They had no leaves, no flowers, no deep roots. But they could hold water and withstand the Sunday. And slowly, they became taller, more structured, more capable. They developed ways to move water through their bodies, to spread their spores farther, to anchor themselves more securely. Over time, forests rose where once there had only been bare rock. Animals were slower to follow. Life in the water had been safe, familiar, full of food and buoyancy. But some creatures began to explore the muddy shallows. Fish developed stronger fins, more flexible skeletons, and eventually, the ability to push themselves onto land for brief moments. Maybe they were chasing food. Maybe they were escaping predators. Maybe it was just curiosity. Whatever the reason, some of them stayed longer and longer. Their bodies changed. Lungs developed. Limbs grew more supportive. The first true steps on land may have been clumsy, but they were enough. These early land dwellers were nothing like the creatures we see today. They were squat and slow, pressed close to the ground. But they could breathe air, and they could move from one pool to the next without drowning. They were survivors, and the land, once empty, began to echo with the faint rustling of movement. The colonization of land did not come with fanfare. It was a quiet claiming of space, a gradual unfolding. And yet it changed everything. For the first time, life touched the sky, felt the wind, and cast shadows that stretched across the soil. The earth was no longer divided between sea and stone. It had become a living world, above and below. As life slowly settled onto land, it began to do something it had been quietly practicing for billions of years. It began to form partnerships, not through language or promises, but through deep, invisible cooperation. Some of the most important advances in the history of life did not come from competition or strength. They came from connection. From unlikely organisms learning to live together, not in battle, but in balance. One of the oldest and most enduring partnerships is the one between fungi and plants. Long before the first forests appeared, this alliance was already forming underground. The earliest plants had no roots, no leaves, and no real way to gather nutrients from the rocky land. Fungi, on the other hand, were experts at breaking down stone and soil. When the two began working together, life on land became possible. The fungi would extend their filaments into the earth, drawing up water and minerals. In return, the plants shared the sugars they made through photosynthesis. Each helped the other do what neither could manage alone. This quiet agreement still exists today. Beneath nearly every forest, a vast network of fungal threads winds its way through the soil. Some call it the wood wide web. It connects trees and plants, allowing them to share nutrients and even warning signals. But in the beginning, it was simply a way to survive. A way to endure the dry, sunlit world that was so different from the sheltering seas. Symbiosis was not limited to plants and fungi. Inside the bodies of animals, tiny microbes began to take up residence. They helped break down food, defend against illness, and supply essential nutrients. In return, they were given a warm, stable home. Over time, these invisible passengers became so essential that the animals could no longer live without them. Even humans carry trillions of these microbial partners, more numerous than our own cells, quietly working in the background of our biology. These relationships may seem small, but they shaped the course of evolution. They allowed life to do more with less, to expand into new environments, to grow larger, live longer, and become more complex. Cooperation offered a kind of resilience that raw strength could not. It created ecosystems, where each form of life supported the others, like threads in a living tapestry. In the quiet corners of the world, mosses still grow with fungal help. Coral reefs, dazzling and colourful, are built on the partnership between tiny animals and photosynthetic algae. Even the green in every leaf is a result of ancient cooperation, when a single-celled ancestor took in a light-harvesting partner and never let it go. Through these connections, life has woven itself into patterns far more intricate than any one organism could have created alone. And what began as accidental coexistence became the foundation for every forest, every prairie, every living landscape. It turns out the path to complexity was not forged through isolation, but through the quiet, enduring power of being together. Life on Earth has always been resilient, but it has also always been fragile. For every quiet victory in evolution, for every partnership and adaptation, there have been times when life came close to disappearing altogether. The story of life is not a straight line from simplicity to complexity. It is a winding path with deep valleys, sudden turns, and more than a few endings. Throughout Earth's long history, there have been moments when the balance was shattered, when the planet itself changed so dramatically that most living things could not survive. These were not ordinary changes. They were cataclysms. Entire ecosystems vanished. Whole families of creatures were wiped out. Forests died. Oceans turned lifeless. We call these moments mass extinctions. At least 5 have happened so far, and each one left a scar in the fossil record, a silent absence where abundance used to be. Volcanoes erupted for centuries, poisoning the air and sea. Asteroids struck with such force that they set the sky on fire. Continents shifted, climates collapsed. The most famous extinction, the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, was caused by an impact that threw dust into the atmosphere and blocked out the sunday. Plants died, and with them, everything that fed on them. But it was not the first time such a thing had happened. Long before that, a different extinction took away almost all marine life. Another killed off ancient forests and reshaped the land. Each event swept away what had once seemed permanent, and yet, each time, something survived. Not the biggest creatures or the most powerful. Often it was the smallest, the most adaptable, the ones who could eat almost anything or live in overlooked places. These survivors became the seeds for the next chapter of life. They carried with them the quiet legacy of everything that had come before. It is humbling to realize that the life we see around us today exists because of what made it through those dark times. The birds in the sky, the grasses in the fields, even the insects beneath our feet, all come from lineages that endured great silence and great loss. Mass extinctions are not only endings, they are also beginnings. They clear space for new forms to rise, even though the cost is immense. This pattern reminds us that life is not guaranteed. It is not a steady march forward. It is a flickering flame that must be shielded, a delicate rhythm that must find its way again and again. Each extinction narrowed the path, but each recovery brought new possibilities. In this way, life has rewritten itself, more than once. It has mourned what was lost and quietly rebuilt. The earth itself has been both the destroyer and the cradle. And through it all, the story has continued, not because life is invincible, but because it refuses to stop trying. Even in the darkest ages, something always holds on, something always remembers how to begin again. Across the countless ages of change, through oceans rising and continents drifting, through extinctions and rebirths, one thing has remained constant. A quiet thread running through every living creature. A message written not in ink or carved in stone, but in a language made of molecules. It is the code that tells life how to be alive. We know it now as DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid is a long and winding molecule, twisted like a spiral staircase, tucked carefully inside nearly every cell. It is not a single sentence, but a vast library, full of instructions. It tells a cell how to build itself, when to divide, what to become, and how to respond to the world around it. It does not think or speak, but it carries memory. Not memory like a photograph or a song, but something deeper, the kind of memory that lives in structure and rhythm. DNA is made from just 4 kinds of smaller parts, often described by the letters A, T, C, and G. These letters form long strings, and the order of them creates meaning. It is like a song made from only 4 notes, but with endless combinations. Every strand of DNA is both familiar and unique. It connects you to every tree, every fish, every blade of grass. The difference between you and a mushroom is only a matter of arrangement. What makes DNA truly remarkable is its ability to copy itself. When a cell divides, the DNA unwinds and duplicates so that the message is passed along. Sometimes the copy is perfect, sometimes it is not. Tiny changes, called mutations, appear in the sequence. Most do nothing at all. Some cause problems, but now and then, a change creates something new, a better way to survive, a different way to grow. Over time, these changes shape the course of evolution. The code rewrites itself slowly, patiently, always with the same 4 letters. If you could stretch out the DNA from a single human cell, it would be over 2 meters long, and yet, it coils so tightly that it fits inside a space, too small to see. It is packed, folded, organized with care, and inside that hidden spiral is a record of everything you are and everything you've inherited. This code is not just in humans. It runs through jellyfish and jaguars, mosses and microbes. It links the earliest ancestors to the newest generations. Even viruses carry snippets of code, though they borrow the machinery of other cells to do anything with it. The world is full of DNA, invisible and persistent, moving through time without rest. What began as simple chains of molecules in a quiet ocean has become a language that life speaks fluently. DNA is not alive, but it makes life possible. It holds the patterns, the recipes, the blueprints for building forests, feathers, lungs, and laughter. And even as the world changes again and again, this thread continues to wind through it all. Always copying, always remembering, always becoming. For all we have learned about life and its beginnings, there is still a soft mystery at the center of it all. A question that lingers, unanswered, even after centuries of wondering. How, exactly, did life begin? We can piece together the puzzle with chemistry, with fossils, with careful reasoning and quiet imagination. We can build models and test ideas, recreate ancient conditions in labs and trace the threads of molecules through time. But still, the first moment, the precise step when non-living matter crossed the invisible line into life, remains just out of reach. It is not for lack of trying. Scientists have explored the building blocks, the way molecules might have joined and folded and reacted in Earth's early oceans. They have studied the strange bubbles that formed from lipids, the loops of RNA that may have whispered the first instructions. They have followed the paths of energy and the clues hidden in ancient rocks. And yet, the leap from chemistry to biology is not easy to explain. It may have happened in many small steps, so gradual that no single one was enough to be called alive. Or perhaps it happened in a way we have not yet imagined at all. The beauty of this mystery is that it does not close the story. It opens it wider. It reminds us that life was not guaranteed. There was nothing in the early Earth that insisted life must emerge. It might have remained a planet of stone and sea and silence. But something happened. And what happened was not sudden or loud. It was slow, patient, and shaped by chance. It is possible we will never find the full answer. Not because it cannot be known, but because it may be too delicate to leave a trace. Molecules do not write history books. They do not mark their beginnings. They simply become what they can and move forward. By the time life was unmistakably present, the clues to how it got there were already fading. The earliest cells did not know they were part of something new. They were simply continuing reactions that had begun long before. Still, the question remains, glowing softly in the background of every discovery. It is not a source of frustration, but of wonder. The mystery does not subtract meaning. It adds a quiet awe. In a universe full of stars and planets, most of them cold and still, this one learned to grow, to swim, to bloom, to think, to look up and ask how it all began. And perhaps, even if we never find the exact moment or mechanism, it is enough to know that it happened. That somehow, through warmth and chance and time, life emerged. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Not with a plan, but with persistence. And in that gentle unfolding, a world once quiet became filled with breath, motion, and memory. A mystery, yes, but one wrapped in the softest kind of hope. Now that we know life exists here, on this soft blue planet spinning through space, the next question feels almost natural. Are we alone? Is life something rare, something precious and unique to Earth? Or is it a pattern that repeats across the cosmos, whispered by starlight and scattered dust? So far, we have not found clear signs of life anywhere else. No alien forests stretching under distant suns, no strange organisms swimming beneath icy moons, no messages drifting through the silence of space. And yet, the building blocks of life seem to be everywhere. We have found complex organic molecules on meteorites, in the clouds of distant planets, and floating in the cold spaces between stars. The ingredients, it seems, are not special to Earth. They are part of the universe itself. Water, so essential to life as we know it, is also surprisingly common. It flows beneath the surface of Mars. It forms icy crusts on Europa and Enceladus, two of the many moons in our solar system. It gathers in the atmospheres of exoplanets far beyond our own Sunday. Where there is water and warmth, the possibility of life feels closer. Not confirmed, not certain, but quietly possible. Still, we do not know whether life is the rule or the exception. It may be that life begins easily, whenever conditions allow, or it may be that Earth won a kind of cosmic lottery. Perhaps the chemistry had to unfold in just the right way, over just the right amount of time, under conditions that rarely appear together. If that is true, we may be alone. Not because the universe is empty, but because life is delicate, a rare alignment of time, temperature, and chance. But if life is common, then the universe could be full of it. Not necessarily civilizations or intelligent beings, but small, quiet forms, microbes beneath ice, simple cells drifting in alien oceans. Life that does not look like us or breathe like us, but still follows the same gentle patterns. Energy gathered, molecules copied, boundaries formed. Life that, like ours, began without fanfare and grew from stillness. There is something peaceful in both possibilities. If we are alone, then we are a rare and beautiful example of what matter can become. If we are not alone, then we are part of a much larger story, one that stretches from world to world, connected not by language but by the quiet rhythm of life itself. We may never find an answer. The stars are far, and the distances between them are vast. But even without certainty, we can still wonder. We can look at the night sky and imagine other worlds just beginning, other molecules folding into shape, other seas still and dark, waiting for the first breath. And whether we are one voice or one among many, the question remains. A soft echo carried across the silence. Could life be everywhere, quietly becoming just beyond what we can see? In the gentle language of science, there is a word that carries a quiet weight, abiogenesis. It means the beginning of life from something that was not alive. The moment, or more likely the process, when chemistry became biology. It is a word filled with both caution and wonder. Scientists use it carefully, because they know how many unknowns still surround it. But beneath the technical tone, the idea itself is one of the most poetic in all of science. Abiogenesis does not require magic or miracles. It asks only for time, ingredients, and the right conditions. It suggests that given the right setting, life can begin again, not through inheritance but through emergence. From water, minerals, and energy, something new can appear. Something that reacts, that replicates, that holds itself together against the forces trying to pull it apart. Life, starting not from life, but from the patterns of nature alone. It is a difficult idea to study, not because it is strange, but because it happened so long ago. The traces of that first beginning have been covered by time. The first true cells, whatever they looked like, would have erased the messier steps that came before them. Like waves washing away footprints in sand, life's success hides its earliest moments. But scientists continue to explore. They look at the ways molecules behave in warm pools and deep-sea vents. They test how simple compounds might assemble under ultraviolet light. They experiment with clay, with ice, with electrical sparks, trying to recreate the whispers of that ancient time. Not to duplicate life exactly, but to understand what might have been possible, what pathways could have led from scattered chemicals to something that could hold itself together and begin to change. The idea behind abiogenesis also reminds us that life is not something separate from nature. It is not an outsider imposed upon the earth. It is something that grew from the earth. A continuation of the same laws and patterns that shape rivers and rocks and clouds. Life is chemistry, rearranged just enough to begin remembering itself. If abiogenesis happened once, it could happen again. Maybe it already has, on another world, or maybe it is still happening here, in quiet corners we do not yet understand. If Earth had never been disturbed, if all life had vanished in a storm or a fire or a flood, would it have started again? The idea suggests it might have. Given warmth, molecules, and a little patience, life seems to have a tendency to appear. The word itself may be long and unfamiliar, but its heart is simple. It tells a story of possibility. That from stillness can come motion, from randomness, pattern, from the inanimate, something that persists, that changes, that grows. Abiogenesis is not just a theory. It is a gentle invitation to see life not as a miracle, but as a quiet inevitability, a soft unfolding of the possible, written in the patient language of time. When we look up at the stars, we see points of light, vast distances away, twinkling softly through the night. But between those stars, hidden in the darkness, is something even more mysterious. Clouds of gas and dust drift through space, stretching across light years in silent, shimmering trails. Inside, these clouds are the raw materials of everything. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, the same elements that built Earth and everything on it. The same ingredients that may be scattered across the universe, waiting for the right moment to stir. Astronomers have pointed their instruments at these distant clouds and found something unexpected. Complex organic molecules, floating in the cold, not just single atoms but chains of carbon, alcohols, acids, even sugars, molecules that resemble the early building blocks of life. These are not alive, they are not forming cells or thoughts or movement, but they are there, drifting between stars, carried on comets, locked in the icy surfaces of distant moons. Some of the meteorites that have landed on Earth carry similar molecules. They are relics of the early solar system, older than any mountain, older than any ocean. Inside them are amino acids, the same kind found in living organisms. They did not come from Earth. They were brought here, carried through space and dropped gently onto a young planet still finding its shape. It is possible, then, that Earth did not begin the story of life completely alone, that some of the pages were delivered from far away. This idea, called panspermia by some, suggests that life or its precursors might travel between worlds, not quickly, not intentionally, but slowly, over aeons. Tucked safely inside rocks, shielded from radiation, frozen in time. And if it could happen once, it might happen again. If Earth can receive, it can also send. A meteor impact could launch debris into space, carrying tiny passengers along for the ride. Perhaps, somewhere else, a distant world has already been touched by these silent visitors. Even without this kind of delivery, the universe itself may already be rich with potential. There are more planets than we can count. Many orbit stars in the right zone for liquid water. Some have atmospheres. Some have oceans beneath thick layers of ice. And if the ingredients are there and the conditions are right, perhaps the quiet process of becoming can begin again. Not quickly, not dramatically, but patiently. Molecules joining, folding, sheltering, chemistry, slowly finding its rhythm. It may be that the universe is not lifeless at all, but simply waiting. That the seeds of life are already scattered, tucked into dust clouds and buried beneath frozen soil. Life, then, would not be a rare miracle, but a slow, steady consequence of time and space. A quiet song that plays wherever the conditions allow. Perhaps we have not heard the chorus yet, but that does not mean it is not singing. It may be humming softly beneath alien skies, in languages we do not yet know how to listen for. And if that is true, then life is not just here. It is on its way, always becoming, everywhere the universe allows it to dream. As we come to the gentle end of this long, quiet journey through time, it is worth remembering something small and beautiful. You are a part of this story. Not just as a listener or a thinker, but as a continuation of the same long process that began in the still waters of a young Earth. The atoms in your body were forged in stars, scattered through space, and gathered slowly into the planet beneath your feet. The molecules that carry your memories, your thoughts, your dreams, all belong to the same lineage that once drifted in warm tide pools, folding and copying in silence. You are not separate from the beginning of life. You are its latest version, a soft echo of something ancient that learned how to persist, something that found a way to change and remember, something that refused to stop. From that first fragile bubble to the cells that now form your skin and blood and brain, the story has never truly paused. It has flowed, always forward, shaped by chance and pressure and time. And in this moment, you are breathing the air made by ancestors you will never meet. Trees still pull carbon from the sky with the help of tiny green machines invented billions of years ago. Bacteria in your gut still carry secrets from the early oceans. Mitochondria, once free living wanderers, now help power every heartbeat. The parts of you that feel the warmth of the sun, that hear music, that drift into dreams, are all wrapped in the quiet logic of life's persistence. Even your DNA, the soft spiral of your story, contains chapters that stretch back to the earliest common ancestors. It tells not only who you are, but where you came from. Every cell holds a memory of life's long path, hidden in the twists and loops of code passed gently from generation to generation. Perhaps the most comforting thought in all of this is not just how far life has come, but how much it still holds. There are worlds we have not yet explored, questions we have not yet asked, stories still waiting in the dust of other planets or the depths of our own oceans, and all of it grows from the same simple roots. Molecules that learn to stay, to copy, to become. So as you rest tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift and soften, know that you are a quiet miracle. Not in a loud or impossible way, but in the truest sense. You are a result of warmth and time, of accidents that became patterns, of silence that found a way to speak. You are life, still unfolding. And somewhere out there, the universe keeps moving. Stars are being born, oceans are forming, molecules are drifting in search of the next quiet beginning. The story is not over. It is only pausing, breathing, gathering strength for what comes next, and you are part of it, a soft, shining thread in the long fabric of becoming. So, as you lie there, somewhere between stars and sleep, remember this. Life didn't arrive like a switch being flipped. It built itself slowly, out of warmth and chaos and chemistry, folding and unfolding across eons. You are not apart from that story. You are its continuation, a thinking, dreaming extension of a molecular melody that began in a warm puddle long ago. Perhaps we'll never know exactly how life began, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the wonder is simply that it did. If this quiet journey brought you a moment of peace, I'd be honored if you left a gentle like, or subscribe to stay connected to more sleepy science stories like this one. And let me know in the comments what part of tonight's story stayed with you as you drifted. Sleep well, dear wanderer, and may your dreams be full of slow beginnings and soft cosmic questions. Good night.